Imagine yourself at 15,000 feet, blind. Not metaphorically blind, but literally. Your canopy is coated in ice so thick you can't distinguish sky from earth. Your aircraft is hurtling through a blizzard at 300 miles per hour, and somewhere below, German fighters are hunting you. Every instinct screams to close up, to protect yourself from the freezing temperatures that now bite at your exposed skin. But you do the unthinkable. You slide back your canopy, exposing yourself completely to the elements, because truly seeing is more important than warmth, more important than comfort, more important perhaps than survival itself. This is the story of a Soviet pilot who made an impossible choice in the skies over the Eastern Front, a choice so counterintuitive, so seemingly suicidal, that it defies everything we think we know about aerial combat. What you're about to hear is not found in most history books. It's a story buried beneath official reports and heroic narratives, a moment when human desperation overcame mechanical limitation, and when one man's extraordinary vision came at the extraordinary price of physical agony. This is the story of Lieutenant Ivan Kozhedub, not the famous ace with the same name, but another pilot whose brief moment of brilliance and madness reveals something profound about the human spirit in war's most extreme conditions. The Eastern Front, 1943. The Soviet Union has been fighting for nearly 2 years against the German invasion. In the skies above the brutal battleground, an equally brutal war rages between Soviet and German air forces. The Soviet Air Force, the Voенно-Vozdushny Sily, or VVS, has suffered catastrophic losses in the early months of Operation Barbarossa. Entire squadrons were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. But by 1943, things have changed. Soviet aircraft production has reached staggering levels, over 25,000 planes this year alone. New designs are rolling off assembly lines, and veteran pilots are returning to the skies with hard-won experience. The Soviet Union has learned to fight in conditions that would ground most air forces. Winter is not merely a season on the Eastern Front, it's a weapon. Temperatures regularly drop to 30°, 22°. Snowstorms can appear without warning, creating what pilots call whiteout conditions, where horizon and ground merge into an indistinguishable void. Soviet pilots developed specialized techniques for cold weather flying, but some problems have no easy solutions. Chief among these, cockpit canopies icing over in flight, effectively blinding pilots at critical moments. The problem is simple physics. At high altitudes in cold weather, moisture inside and outside the cockpit freezes instantly on the canopy. Aircraft designers have tried various solutions: heating elements, special coatings, chemical sprays, but none work reliably in combat conditions. For German pilots flying superior Messerschmitts with more advanced de-icing systems, this is an inconvenience. For Soviet pilots in their simpler Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters, it's often a death sentence. You can't fight what you can't see. You can't avoid what you can't anticipate. And you certainly can't land what you can't see through. Lieutenant Ivan Kozhedub, no relation to the famous ace-flies, a Yak-1B fighter with the 32nd Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. He's 23 years old, from a small village outside Smolensk that was occupied by the Germans for 2 years before being liberated. He doesn't fly for glory or for the Mother Earth slogans plastered across airfield walls. He flies because he saw what occupation looks like up close. Because his younger sister disappeared during a German anti-partisan operation and was never seen again. Because every German plane he might shoot down represents a small measure of justice in a world that has lost its moral compass entirely. On January 17, 1943, Kozhedub takes off from a forward airstrip near Voronezh as part of a 6-plane patrol. The weather is already deteriorating: low clouds, heavy snow, and dropping temperatures. Intelligence reports suggest German reconnaissance aircraft have been active in the area, possibly preparing for a renewed offensive. The mission is simple: patrol a 30-kilometer sector at 15,000 feet and engage any enemy aircraft you encounter. Simple, that is, until the weather turns from bad to impossible. 40 minutes into the patrol, the storm hits without warning. One moment you're flying between cloud layers with reasonable visibility. The next, you're in a whiteout so complete that disorientation becomes immediate and dangerous. Your instruments become your only connection to reality. Then comes the real problem. The ice. It forms with terrifying speed on your canopy, first as a thin film, then thickening rapidly until you're essentially flying inside a frosted glass box. You can make out vague shapes, perhaps the wing of your leader's aircraft ahead, but nothing more. Inside your flight suit, the temperature is dropping. The Yak-1B's heating system, never particularly effective, is now completely overwhelmed. Your breath freezes on the inside of the canopy, adding to the visibility problem. Standard procedure is simple. Break formation and descend immediately, hoping to find clearer air below. But you can't. Your radio, working intermittently at best in these conditions, suddenly comes alive with desperate calls. German fighters have been spotted below, and they're not just reconnaissance planes, they're Focke-Wulf 190s, heavily armed and dangerous. Your squadron leader orders everyone to maintain position and prepare for engagement. This is the moment when training meets reality, when procedure meets impossibility. You're flying blind, in formation, with enemy aircraft nearby. Your wingman, flying slightly behind and to your right, is just a shape in the white. Your instruments tell you you're maintaining altitude and speed, but your eyes tell you nothing at all. The tactical situation is deteriorating rapidly, and you have a choice to make: follow protocol and descend, potentially abandoning your squadron to face the Germans alone, or stay in the fight despite being effectively blind. What happens next is not in any training manual. It's not something even the most experienced Soviet pilots would recommend. But in the chaos of that moment, with the fate of his squadron potentially hanging in the balance, Lieutenant Kozhedub makes a decision that seems to defy all logic and survival instinct. He reaches for the canopy release mechanism. The cold hits you like a physical blow. At 35 degrees C, and with wind chill from your 300 mph speed, the effective temperature is now below 60 degrees C. Your exposed skin immediately begins to freeze, but you can see. Not perfectly, the snow still stings your eyes, and the wind makes them water, but you can see. You can make out the shapes of your squadron mates. You can see the darker clouds below where the German fighters are hiding. Most importantly, you can see your enemy when they appear. The physical cost is immediate and severe. Within seconds, your face is numb. Your eyelashes are frozen together. The moisture in your breath freezes on your oxygen mask, making each breath more difficult than the last. But you're still flying, still fighting, still seeing. The German fighters emerge from the clouds below, and despite your physical suffering, you're the first to spot them. You break formation, diving toward thee. What follows is one of the most extraordinary aerial engagements of the entire Eastern Front. Kozhedub, despite the extreme physical discomfort, manages to shoot down one of the Focke-Wulfs. His ability to see clearly when others couldn't gives him a crucial advantage in the chaotic battle. His squadron, inspired by his seemingly impossible action, fights with renewed determination. They lose 2 aircraft, but drive off the Germans, who likely never understood what they were witnessing: a Soviet pilot flying with his cockpit open in a blizzard, as if defying nature itself. The landing is almost as dangerous as the combat. By the time Kozhedub returns to his airstrip, he's suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. His ground crew is shocked to find him with his canopy open, barely conscious, his face covered in ice. They have to physically lift him from the cockpit, his frozen hands unable to release the harness. The medical officer initially thinks he's dealing with a dead man, so severe are the cold injuries. Kozhedub survives, but the cost is high. He loses parts of several fingers on his right hand and suffers permanent nerve damage in his face. His flying career is effectively over. Yet when his commanding officer visits him in the hospital, Kozhedub doesn't express regret. "I could see," he reportedly said, his voice slurred by the nerve damage. "For the first time in that storm, I could see." His action, while never officially sanctioned, becomes the stuff of legend within his regiment. A story told in hushed tones in barracks late at night, a story about what a pilot might do when the only alternative is blindness. The story of Kojadoub's flight raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of courage and the limits of human endurance. Was his action heroic or reckless? Brilliant or mad? The answer, perhaps, is that it was both. War has always demanded that humans push beyond normal limits, to do things that would be unthinkable in civilian life. But Kojadoub's choice represents something more extreme even than most wartime sacrifices, a moment when a pilot chose sight over safety, effectiveness over self-preservation, to an almost unimaginable degree. The technical problem that led to Kojadoub's extraordinary action would eventually be solved. Later Soviet aircraft, particularly the Yak-3 and La-7, featured improved canopy de-icing systems that made such drastic measures unnecessary. But the story remained, preserved not in official histories but in the oral tradition of pilots, a reminder of the extreme conditions under which they operated and the extraordinary solutions they sometimes devised. What makes Kojadoub's story particularly poignant is how it reveals the hidden calculus of survival in extreme situations. We often think of survival as preserving oneself at all costs. But for those fighting in the most extreme conditions of the Eastern Front, survival sometimes required the opposite, calculated self-endangerment for the sake of greater effectiveness. Kojadoub chose temporary, severe injury over immediate, certain blindness. He chose physical pain over tactical uselessness. In the mathematics of survival in impossible conditions, his was a logical, if extreme, solution. The psychological dimension of this story is equally fascinating. What goes through a person's mind in the moment they decide to expose themselves to 60 degrees wind? Is it conscious calculation or instinct? Is it courage or desperation? The pilots who knew Kojadoub described him as quiet, thoughtful, not particularly reckless. His action wasn't born of recklessness, but of a different kind of logic, one that prioritized mission effectiveness over personal safety when the two came into irreconcilable conflict. There's another dimension to this story that deserves consideration: the relationship between human and machine in warfare. We often think of technological progress as making human sacrifice less necessary. But in this case, it was the limitations of technology that forced an extraordinary human response. The machine couldn't solve the icing problem, so the human body became the solution. Kojadoub essentially made himself a component of the aircraft, a living, breathing de-icing system that sacrificed itself for the greater mission. The legacy of Kojadoub's flight extends beyond the immediate tactical situation. In the months that followed, his story reached Soviet aircraft designers who accelerated work on more effective de-icing systems. Sometimes, it takes an extreme human action to highlight a technical problem that needs solving. The suffering of one pilot contributed to the safety of hundreds who would follow. This is how progress often works in wartime, not through careful planning and testing alone, but through the crucible of extreme experience. After the war, Kojadoub, his flying career ended by his injuries, became an instructor at a flight school where he rarely spoke of his famous flight. When asked about it by curious cadets who had heard the story, he would simply say that extreme situations require extreme responses. He never presented himself as a hero, but as someone who had been faced with an impossible choice and made what seemed to be the only logical decision at the time. He died in 1978, his story largely unknown outside the small circle of Soviet aviation enthusiasts. The story of the Soviet pilot who flew with his cockpit open in a storm is more than just an interesting anecdote from the Eastern Front. It's a window into the extreme conditions under which the Soviet Air Force operated, the creative solutions they devised, and the human cost of fighting a war in some of the most inhospitable conditions on Earth. It reminds us that behind every technological limitation is a human being who must find a way to overcome it, sometimes at extraordinary personal cost. When we remember the air war on the Eastern Front, we often think of the aces with their impressive kill counts, the technological race between designers, or the strategic importance of air superiority. We rarely think about the practical problems of flying in extreme cold, the desperate improvisations required to keep fighting when equipment fails, or the individual moments when human flesh becomes the solution to mechanical failure. Kojdub's story challenges us to look beyond the familiar narratives and consider the countless small, extraordinary acts that made up the larger tapestry of the war. In the end, what does Kojdub's flight tell us about war, about technology, about the human capacity to endure the impossible? Perhaps it reminds us that the most advanced technology is still limited by the physical world, and that human ingenuity often involves finding ways to work around those limitations, even at great personal cost. Perhaps it shows us that courage isn't always about facing death, but sometimes about choosing a difficult, painful path over an easier, more dangerous one. Or perhaps it simply reminds us that in the extreme conditions of war, the line between genius and madness, between brilliance and recklessness, becomes dangerously thin. The next time you see an old warplane in a museum, remember that behind the metal and machinery are stories of human beings pushed to their limits. Stories like Kojdub's, stories that rarely make it into the history books, but that tell us more about the reality of war than any strategic analysis or technical specification. These are the stories that remind us of the extraordinary things ordinary humans are capable of when faced with impossible choices. The story of the Soviet pilot who flew with his cockpit open in a storm is not just about one man's extreme action in impossible conditions. It's about the relationship between humans and machines in warfare, about the limits of technology and the boundlessness of human adaptation, about the strange mathematics of survival that emerge when normal rules no longer apply. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not as a tale of heroism or recklessness, but as a testament to the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go when the alternative is failure. The next time you face a seemingly impossible situation, remember Lieutenant Kojdub and his open cockpit flight, and ask yourself what you might be willing to endure when seeing clearly becomes more important than comfort or safety.